Welcome to the Leadership for Society program. I'm Professor Brian Lowery at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and the theme of this year's series is the intersection of public and private leadership. And today our guest
Amazing.
is Regina Wallace-Jones, the CEO of ActBlue. Hi, Regina. So nice to have you.
Hi there.
Great. So it'd be useful, Regina, if you could give us a little bit of your background, your professional background before becoming the CEO of ActBlue.
Fantastic. Thank you for inviting me to your program. And a couple of reflections here. First of all, I spent my undergraduate years at Stanford, so it is actually my alma mater. And at the time that I was there, I studied electrical engineering. This was well before the consumer internet was really on the scene, and found post graduation that that was becoming the predominant way in which the engineering community was going to be contributing. And so, came out of Stanford, spent um, less than a year actually at Motorola working on Iridium, which is it was at the time a big satellite communications uh, product that was designed to give communication strength in remote places. Think Antarctica, or places that are incredibly remote. It was a satellite phone that was priced way more expensive than the market wanted to bear, and it was a total failure. But also for me, I shouldn't say a total failure. The satellites are still in orbit today, and they're being used for other things. But that particular product launch was a total failure. From there, I remember coming out of engineering school, my first engineering job, and feeling like I had picked poorly what I was supposed to be doing, and so went and grabbed a master's in public policy from UCLA. So I'm also a Bruin. And then coming out of graduate school, very quickly realized that the best way for me to earn, which for young adults is pretty important, was to go right back to engineering. So I did that for 25 years. I spent those years at Yahoo. I spent them at Facebook. I spent them at eBay, and some smaller companies as well. And simultaneously maintain my commitment to the public by working on various campaigns and causes, and ultimately running for office myself in 2018. At that point, I served on city council. I was the mayor of the city of East Palo Alto, and a COVID mayor at that. So it was a pretty chaotic time, and came out of both my role as a technical executive and as the mayor of East Palo Alto just about the same time. I took a break to gather myself, because I've been known to gather myself every 4 or 5 years. And when I finished gathering myself, I was contacted for a confidential search to be the CEO of ActBlue. That journey was just about a 4-month journey, at the end of which landed me in the role, and I've been in it ever since. So this is my third year as CEO.
Okay, so let's get into Act Blue then. Can you tell us what is it that Act Blue does exactly?
So ActBlue is the largest and most effective uh, fundraising platform for Democrats and aligned candidates, and also for causes. So think about moveon.org, or colorofchange.org. Um, but the vast majority of fundraising that's done on the platform is for candidates, starting from the president all the way down to Senate, Congress, governors, state legislators, etc. We've been in existence for about 21 years, so we are also one of the longest on the market. And a lot of people inappropriately name us as payment processors. We're actually aggregating a number of different payments processors on the back end. But in addition to that, also bring fraud detection in. We are also um, subject to the Federal Elections Committee and Commission rather, and need to be compliant with laws that govern federal elections. This includes compliance around giving by jurisdiction, so you can actually tell at the city, state, and even at the national level when a donor has given to the limit for that particular jurisdiction, and we will stop giving at that point, which classic payments processors do not do. So we're sort of doing that plus plus to make sure that the rules of democracy and the rules of elections are really honored and preserved from a giving perspective. The one other thing I would just want to offer here is that we really give homage to Howard Dean, who ran a campaign for the president back in 2004, driven largely by small dollar donations. And so he was one of he was not victorious in his pursuit of the presidency, but really demonstrated that it should not be elections should not be solely driven by millionaires and billionaires who are having special events in their home and imposing their individual wills on democracy and on the political process, but rather that many hands can make light loads, and that we really do, focus on donors who are giving no more than $30 to $40 on average to candidates and causes. And we find that for a donor that's willing to do that, it's actually way more powerful than someone giving hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars to a campaign, because those $40 represent a vote as well, and really show us who's got momentum in various jurisdictions across the country. So we really consider ourselves to be a grassroots platform that is unlocking the power of many to express our will and our wishes as it relates to candidates in the political process.
Hmm. So I appreciate that last bit.
Mm.
So I was going to ask, like, what is the public good that ActBlue serves? And I hear you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, I hear you saying that it helps people with smaller amounts of money feel like they can contribute in a meaningful way to financing the candidates that they want to support. Is that?
That's correct.
Mm. So how do you deal with the fact that a large part of what people are concerned about, I think this is true in campaigns in the United States, is the amount of money going into them. So really what you're doing is, it's true that now you can have small amounts of money coming. I mean, I don't have millions and millions of dollars. I can donate money and contribute to my favorite candidate or cause, as you mentioned, but it still means that the politics are driven by money. Is that a concern that one should have, that you have? And how does Act Blue try to engage with the concern? There's just too much money in politics.
Well, so let's look at the most atomic level of this, which would be, a local election. And I'll use my campaign as an example of that, because I'm most familiar with it and very, very clear on what the dollars were that were being utilized at that point. So for my local campaign, I raised $40,000. Not the biggest fundraiser, not the smallest fundraiser, but a respectable fundraise for a local campaign. And when I think about the things that had to be done as I was campaigning for the seat that I was running for, there were a couple of realities that I had. One was that I was a tech worker, period. And anyone who's spent any time working in tech knows that the amount of time that is uh, the amount of your time that is absorbed doing work is substantially high, and therefore the amount of time remaining, in particular for me as a wife and a mother as well, to just be around doing civic things is substantially low. So though I had tremendous interest in serving in public office, I did not have tremendous popularity at the time. I was going to work and coming home every day and raising, young children and just, trying to make it happen. And so the fact that I knew or did not know the 30,000 neighbors that I had in the city of East Palo Alto as I was running for office, it was a true fact, right? And so part of the journey that I had from the point that I announced, which was on my birthday in 2018, to the time that I was up for election, which was I think it was November 5th and November 8th of that same year, is that I had to be known over that period of time.
Mhm.
um, Being known is one of the hardest things for anyone to overcome. I mean, we've manufactured these social platforms for people to create influencers and followers, and this is, something that is relatively new in the arc of the history of America. But we can follow everything from TV commercials, radio before that, all the way up to the methods and the ways that are being utilized today to say none of them are cheap undertakings, and none of them are available to anyone at the cost of no dollars, at least not the things that are getting the most eyes. So if you only have a fixed amount of time and you haven't already built TV presence, then a substantial part of dollars that it takes to get elected is just really about being known by the voters who are going to ultimately have to cast a vote for you. And the journey for every candidate is going to be very, very different. But of that $40,000, what I would say is that 10,000 of it, 25% of it, was just used to create video spots, et cetera, that can be moved across social media to the 30,000, people in my city that I was targeting, right? Another, you know, 20% of it was used for print mailers and yard signs and other things that allowed people to know that I had some momentum, right? Some 10% of it was used to pay a little bitty honorarium to my campaign manager, who, by the way, had another full-time job, but at the local level was taking all of her extra time to organize my campaign. And I only gave that to her at the end of the campaign after everything else was paid, right? So that I ended the campaign with nothing. And as you
Mhm.
can see, the dollars, trickle away very, very quickly for, getting to, um, path to being elected.
Mhm.
So if you happen to be someone who is already independently wealthy, which, I've done well for myself, but I would never claim to be a Rockefeller or a Roosevelt. And, you have a fixed amount of time, um, and you're also working, as most local elected officials are doing, then you do have to utilize other ways to get your messages out there quickly, and the cost of that is not free by any means. But of course, there are other things that I leverage, like debates and, speeches and other things. All of that was available to me at zero cost, but that would have been necessary but not sufficient to get to the tipping point of, votes for a first-time candidate who was coming onto the scene for the first time and spending the majority of her time in tech, right? So if you start to scale this up to, your state level races, to your governor's races, to your federal races, and ultimately to the president, you can very quickly see that either you end up with candidates who have already spent all of their time being known, right? And this is not happening right now. There's plenty of TV presences that are putting themselves out in public spaces. But for the rest of us, right, those dollars are dollars that are utilized to, pay for full-time staff. In my case, I had a gracious volunteer staff, but we only needed, 2,700 votes to win. When you need 81 million votes to win, you don't have necessarily the opportunity to have people working on a volunteer basis to do the work that you need to get done to make sure that your candidacy is advanced, right? So when you're paying a whole national apparatus, when you're paying for media spots, when you're paying for all of the things to be known, right? To be known and to gain credibility among voters, these things bear a cost. And
Mhm.
the only thing that we're doing at ActBlue is making sure that the necessary funds are there to help enable campaigns and some of the, adjacent causes to have the resources that they need to give themselves a fighting chance. And
I see.
still, they have to fight for it.
Yeah, and so here's the thing, that was a very helpful description of why the money is necessary and what you're helping people, reason you're helping people get that money from small donors. And the question I have is why just Democratic candidates? What you're describing is doesn't have anything to do with partisan ideology. So I'm curious why the organization just doesn't do that for any candidate. Why do you do it for exclusively Democratic candidates?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, history would, I think, reveal that when technology platforms initially started for um, uh, political candidacies, they were fairly nonpartisan, right? And there's still some products on the market that claim to be independent and or nonpartisan. And what we find is that um, the trust index is relatively low for these products, right? What happens is that candidates who are running as independents or candidates who are running, in some cases, for nonpartisan seats may use these products. But certainly as you start to move up into federal roles, the seats are not nonpartisan, which means that the voters are aggregated in ways that are not nonpartisan. And so when you worry, and these are not necessarily worries that I had, but they are worries that I can appreciate grew more and more as the political space became more driven by technology platforms and less by, door to door. Let's remember that Abraham Lincoln was also he worked for the post office, and so a lot of his campaigning was knocking on doors as he was delivering mail, and in so doing was more and more known by his neighbors in the community around him, even as he lost many, many races before he won, right? That in those days, right, sort of our knowing was guided by papers and by personal relationships. And in a world where information is driven much more by information technology and platforms that are increasingly not well understood by the majority of the public in the way that papers that are stored in our homes, on our desks, in our kitchen cabinets, et cetera, were, that the desire to have a greater amount of control and also a sense that those who are holding that data are loyal to ideologies as opposed to loyal to technology principles alone started to grow. And so look in the early 2000s, what if you follow the whole, the tracking and the creation of products, what you start to see is that partisan segmentation as platforms become more and more present in the political process and trust becomes less and less present about what are the people doing that are holding this data? What are their beliefs and how is it that they might leverage the data and the information that they're holding and carrying in ways that are additive and also ways that are unproductive in the political process, right? So today there are certainly products, as I said, that exist that are nonpartisan. They tend not to get the same level of engagement as the more partisan products, particularly as you move to, federal elections, where ultimately you do have to um, typically have to name a party to really get viability in the election process.
I see. And so naming a party is and this is maybe a distinction without a difference. I don't know, or a difference without a distinction. I don't know exactly how that goes. But do you all take political positions, or is it just that you serve in such a way that there are certain that you generally have, um, liberal candidates that you're serving? Does that make sense? Do you, as an organization, do you take positions on issues?
So, our employees are a collection of people who would otherwise self-identify as center to left leaning. right? Which means that the things that are guiding, most of their thoughts and ideologies would be anchored there. And of course, we're curious, and of course, we're antagonizing and, sort of not antagonizing, but interrogating. I'm sorry, that's the wrong word. Interrogating issues and making sure that we thoroughly understand. But, in the end, humans are humans for sure. And as an organization, we absolutely have alliances. So, for example, we have customers who would be, at the Democratic National Committee. We would have Senate committee and congressional committee customers, and all of this is very publicly, sort of uh, known for ActBlue because we are also the most transparent organization. But we absolutely have alliances there that are driving platforms that are, senator left leaning. When it comes to candidates, we tend not to take a position on candidates, right? You can imagine in any jurisdiction, there might be a number of candidates on the left who are running for at the federal level who are running for a position, and we do not put our thumb on the scale about A or B candidate. We let them get through the primary process. And once where there is a candidate that is presenting in a two-party system as, the Democrat, there may be opportunities for us to, offer endorsement support contributions. Still, then we do that, very, very rarely. Look, in a world where we're not, for example, a two-party system, right, where we're just, a collection of ideologies, and we are allowing every candidate to just get out there and make their best stab at, swaying the American public to think any particular way. Maybe there's a world for that. That's not the world that we're in,
Mhm.
right? And so the world that we're in really does call for us to, sort of establish where it is that we are going to anchor
Mhm.
our energy, and where it is that we're going to anchor our, influence and support. And it also, makes it very clear where we're not anchored. So, for example, you would not find uh, any Republican candidates, at least who are, running as Republicans, running their campaigns on ActBlue.
Yeah. And so that brings me to my next question, which is recently the Trump administration is calling for an investigation into ActBlue. So I'm not going to get into like the particulars of why and all that, but um, it does put you in a different position, I think, in terms of political engagement. And I'll draw a parallel with academic institutions. So
Mhm.
when the way that academic institutions, and this is my rendition, this is all over the news, so people can look and draw their own conclusions about how it's going. But when the administration started to challenge academic institutions, Columbia and Harvard being the biggest, the most well known, a lot of academic leaders expressed a sense that or expressed that they maybe had fumbled with the public. You can argue that's true or not true, but that they had lost the trust of the public. So there was some degree of mea culpa that was expressed by some organizations, some academic institutions, and then also an attempt to defend their place in civil society, like their role, right? So that's from my perspective, that's been the tactic. Some degree
Mhm.
of apologizing and then some degree of defense. Some of that recently has been collective. I'm
Mhm.
curious how you think about that for your organization. So, do you think that there's some like looking and self-reflection and saying like, hey, have we lost it? Did we lose the trust of the public? Have we done something wrong? Is there something we should apologize for? And then defense, is there just a possibly just saying like this is not really not founded in anything? There's no basis in reality for this and just defense. I'm just curious how you're responding to or how you plan to respond to the challenges that are being posed by the administration or being brought to bear on your organization.
Let me answer this in two ways. The first is I draw uh, deep segmentation between academic institutions and institutions like ActBlue for some important reasons, right? Most academic institutions receive federal funding in some way, shape, or form. And in receiving those federal funds are in some ways subject to substantially more scrutiny from the taxpayers collective, right? Liberal, conservative, whatever they are, assuming that we all do a good job of paying our taxes, right? Those federal dollars would be drawn from um, let's assume for a minute most people equally, which means that if the institution receives those federal dollars, sure, right? I mean, if there's some question about how those dollars are being used or how they're being, directed to support or not support certain ideologies, um, I might not like it personally, but it would be fair game to call those things into question and to make sure that there is a rationalization of how the dollars are being deployed and then how they are being utilized inside of the institution. ActBlue, although we are a nonprofit, we do not receive any federal dollars, nor do we receive, dollars from, funders, if you will. The ActBlue is, organized as a nonprofit and operates like internally, like many technology companies operate. We angle towards being sustainable. We survive on a small little transactional um, take that we actually get from processing the dollars themselves. And the vast majority of what keeps ActBlue in business is tips. And the people who are giving those dollars are people who are aligned with the candidates and the causes that are operating on those platforms. So there is no mea culpa here. We rise and fall together. And the thing that I'm very clear about, because we have opted to be a nonprofit, is that we are transparent. Our filings are so large; they're larger than anybody's, because we both disclose every single donation that comes onto the platform, as well as every single operating expense that we deploy as an organization. Which I don't know many organizations that do that. So that's the one thing. The other is how we will respond to the administration. And my general perspective on this is that it's clear how ActBlue always responds to administrative inquiries of any sort, whether they be on the left or the right, because we are transparent, because we are, a nonprofit, because we, really consider ourselves to be a deeply law-abiding institution. We always cooperate. This is the first time that we have been subject to congressional inquiries. It's certainly the first time that a president of the United States has called into question our operating practices, but it would not be the first time that attorneys general, state attorneys generals, for example, have looked into the practices of ActBlue. The key difference in the past has been when they are inquiring in a nonpartisan way, looking at all platforms and naming all platforms. And under those circumstances, ActBlue always shines through as the platform that responds transparently and then is dismissed for no trouble found. In this case, it is deeply partisan, ActBlue being the only organization that has been named. And the troubling part of that is that we know that is because ActBlue is more effective. Still, um, efficacy aside, right, where one organization has raised 1.8 billion and the other has raised 4.7 billion. I can understand why someone would be questioning how is it that one could be way more effective than the other. And the key issue here is that one organization is 21 years old and the other is 6 when read. So when we were 6 years old, we were raising substantially less. And when we're 21, we are raising substantially more. But our practices around being transparent and working with government institutions to make sure that they are clear on those differences has been a posture for ActBlue from its beginning, and that's one that we will maintain.
So, okay, I want to push you a little bit on that and say I completely understand that response and cooperating with government, presuming, I mean, you operate on your nonprofits, you do operate under particular laws, and the public trust is important. And like saying, I think this is where you are not that different from educational institutions, right? It's public trust is incredibly important. And so but I do want to ask, is there a time when cooperation turns into resistance if some entity is not acting in good faith? And so this is hypothetical, so I'm not suggesting that you say, well, this is where we would change, but do you think there's a limit to cooperation?
If an institution is not acting in good faith, so let me make sure I understand the question. So if I believe that the Attorney General is not acting in good faith and is inquiring into practices in an unethical way, would I resist? Is that the question that you're asking?
I would say like that is a very more specific question than what I'm asking, but yes. So if whatever you think of is not in good faith, there's a lot of ways that could show up. But is there a point at which you would say we're going to resist?
So look, I don't want to get ahead of myself because the legal institutions have not shown themselves to be institutions that are acting in bad faith, right? I draw a very, very hard line between political rhetoric
Hmm.
and legal inquiry. The rhetoric is ridiculous. It is filled with disinformation and misinformation and posturing and all kinds of things. And so far, what I have seen from legal institutions that have engaged with ActBlue, they have been law abiding. So I am going to assume good faith here and assume that now that something is in the hands of a lawyer who is sworn to the bar, just like every other lawyer, that we will see good faith. And if I have reason to believe something different in the future, I'll say something, right?
Hmm.
But historically, this has not been a key issue for ActBlue, and I am going to believe that our Attorney General will also be a law-abiding citizen and use her power in a way that is appropriate and that has been levied upon her as the Attorney General of the United States.
Mm. And at this moment, and I'll talk about the rhetoric for a second that you just mentioned, and put aside the actions of any particular office. What do you think are from your perspective as someone who runs a nonprofit, engages in supporting political actors and causes? What are you most concerned about right now in terms of the intersection between um, the private sector, and here I mean not necessarily just business, but people's lives in the public sector. So, I say people's lives, that includes their engagements with businesses and also engagements with the government. What are your biggest concerns right now about the nature of the rhetoric or just the current political climate?
I would say there are a couple, and if I step out of, being the CEO of ActBlue and just look at life and look at myself inside of that life, there are a couple of things that I uh, call forward right now. The first is I've got parents and grandparents that are alive, right, in their 70s and in their 90s. And, one of the things that they are most concerned about is the appearance of instability of Social Security, which is part of the way that they sustain themselves and survive as retired humans, right? And in particular, I know my mother has been, expressing her concerns about the reduction of workforce, the reliance on websites and digital mechanisms for engaging, and her acknowledgement that not all seniors have the fluency to do that well, right? And as I said, she's in her 70s and she is doing quite fine, but my grandmother is 94, right? A totally different ball game there. So that for me, being one of the larger parts of our population that is feeling substantial unrest, is a big concern for me. It is obviously a big concern for me that institutions of higher learning are being targeted and manipulated in ways that I find personally um, uh, deplorable, even if there is some kind of relationship between federal funding and justification for why this is happening. But I think that that is, a big deal to me. It's a big deal to me the way that we are interacting with our allies and friends around the world, in ways that um, at times border on being aggressive and disrespectful to allies and antagonizing unnecessarily to those who are not allies, right? So obviously the way that we are engaging with the world around us matters to me, and the extent to which we are actually being diplomatic and good citizens in that journey feels important to me. There is, obviously the chaos that some of us experienced as we moved very aggressively into what felt like an unvetted tariffs program. And while I'm not at retirement, I'm going to retire at some point, not in the, not so far future. And, I will say that absolutely had personal impact on me in the form of, a 401k that, dropped pretty precipitously really, really fast, and to the point where the banking institutions were calling me, right, to try to make changes and to de-risk the ways in which my 401k was deployed. These are things that I'm, deeply feeling personally. I've got two teenagers. I worry every day about the extent to which information and disinformation is making their ways into the social media platforms that, they are engaging with, to the point where I am limiting, these are not babies, right? These are high schoolers, limiting the extent to which they are, engaging on these platforms for a couple of reasons. One is for their own mental health, but two, misinformation and disinformation is so, vast at this point, that I also wonder about how is it that they are viewing their mom, their hardworking mom that they have known and loved all of their lives, and I've loved them in return, right? So, look, for me, I think the things that are bothering me are likely the things that are bothering the majority of Americans. And, there's obviously subtext under all of this, that I worry about as well, in terms of addiction and, you know, health and all of the things that, just make us us. I think what we all want is for leaders that uh, respect people, respect the human condition, that really endeavor to do good while simultaneously minimizing, if not eliminating, doing harm in the process, and that are doing it in a way that models for us and for our children that this is a productive way to be.
Mm,
And to the extent that we are getting that or not getting that now or at any time in the future, this is a case for all of us to be concerned, not just me. So
mhm,
this is the mindset that I bring into obviously my work every day. I try to be a level-headed leader at ActBlue, but it's certainly um, the things that I look to for my political leaders to embody. Uh,
mhm. And so this is the last question I ask everyone, and I think you might have gone already or some ways toward answering it. But if you were going to give people who are listening or watching one short piece of advice about engaging as a leader, given your both private leadership and public leadership experience, what would it be?
Listen, I believe that the most important thing that I and we can all continue to do is to engage with curiosity with the information that is coming into into our worlds, right? That we not necessarily conclude that the things that we are reading or watching or hearing are the truth, but we do our fair due diligence inside and outside of our echo chambers to really find truth in the things that are being, conveyed to us. This is something, frankly, that is becoming harder and harder with with the production of bots that are creating tons of information, with the social echo chambers that are prioritizing and or deprioritizing speech. This is harder and harder, and it seems to me that part of the critical thinking and analysis that used to be a clear part of the educational process is also being underfunded in some ways. That students need to be able to not just look at X, but to look at all of the things that are being provided to them and to find truth in all of that. So that is the big charge that I have for myself. It's the big charge that I have for my children. I remember just a very quick story as we wrap up that my daughter, my younger daughter, who is, who got a growing fear of her own mortality during COVID because she was an elementary school kid at the time. She's now a teenager who doesn't like to fly. And I remember being in Washington, D.C. when the helicopter and plane crash happened. And I remember her being home and her being particularly aware of the fact that this plane had crashed. And because of that, all of the news was beginning to index on plane crashes, right? So she started to get messages about crashes that were happening all over the place, right? And so she said to me, Mom, I want us to cancel our summer vacation because I don't want to get in a plane because crashes are up, right? And I said, okay, let us just look at the data to make sure that what you're hearing is consistent with what has actually occurred. And after we spent an hour looking at the data around plane crashes over the last, several decades, what we found was that plane crashes were declining, including this very year where this plane crash had occurred, that plane crashes were more often happening in private planes than they were in commercial planes, even though the news was indexing around, a different story. And that she, in fact, had nothing really to be worried about, that it would be more dangerous for her to get in my car with me in the morning and drive to school than it would be to get on a plane and go for summer vacation. And, after we took the time to process that, she was relieved. She still cut the flight back that she was willing to take, only wanting to go on a 4-hour flight, not a 10-hour flight, but she at least had the rationale in her brain, right, that the news was giving her a false impression about what was happening with respect to plane travel, right? This is the kind of discipline that I want us to have as humans, because this is the kind of critical thinking that is really required for all of us to prevail and to move forward as healthy humans, not as humans that are constantly warring with each other.
I appreciate that. Let's all hope for more critical thinking. So I really appreciate you talking to me, Regina. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.